The water commissioner's voice carried through the open window of the Territorial Land Office in Seco Springs, New Mexico, on a Wednesday morning in the late summer of 1884, and what he said was that the survey had been finalized, and the land in question belonged, as it had always belonged, to the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company, and that any persons currently occupying or farming or drawing well water from said parcel were welcome to present their documentation to the contrary, or vacate by the 1st of October. Cole Harlan was leaning against the exterior wall of that building, 3 feet to the left of the window, drinking water from a tin cup and reviewing a set of wanted notices that had come up from Las Cruces on the morning coach. He was not in the land office because he had not been invited into the land office, and in 1884 in Seco Springs, the question of whether a man who was half Apache could simply walk into a territorial government building and be treated as a lawman first and an inconvenience second was a question that got answered differently on different days, depending on who was behind the desk. Cole Harlan had learned to read the room before he entered it, and what he had read through that window before he heard the commissioner speak was a room that was not ready for him yet. So he waited outside and listened to what the room said when it thought no one important was near. He folded the wanted notices and put them in his coat pocket. The cup he set on the sill of a different window, empty, so someone would find it and understand it had been filled and used and returned without theft. Then he stood still and let the commissioner's words settle, because the words carried more than their surface, and Cole Harlan was a man who believed in letting a thing settle before he formed a judgment about it. Seco Springs in the summer of 1884 was a town of roughly 900 souls, situated in a valley in the high desert country of the New Mexico Territory, 40 miles northeast of Las Cruces by wagon road, and considerably fewer as a raven navigated, though ravens did not carry freight and did not care about the condition of the road. The Organ Mountains stood to the southwest, their ridgelines dark against the sky in the mornings and pale and washed out by noon when the heat pressed down, and the dust that rose from every unpaved street hung in a haze that softened the whole town into something that looked less real than it was. The Rio Seco, which gave the town its name, ran along the eastern edge of the settled area, and was not the kind of river that inspired poetry. It was 8 feet wide in spring, 4 in summer, and in drought years it went to a trickle that was more geology than hydrology, a line of darker gravel in an otherwise brown landscape. But it ran, and in a country where nothing was guaranteed, the fact that it ran was a form of wealth. The town lived on cattle and a modest amount of dry farming, and in 1884 both industries were in the kind of trouble that does not announce itself loudly, but makes itself known through small accumulations of difficulty. A bad season here, a price drop there, a well that went brackish, a note that came due 6 weeks before the cattle moved. The Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company had arrived in the territory in 1881, with capital from a Philadelphia investment group, and had spent 3 years acquiring grazing rights and water access across the valley, not by force in any direct sense, but through the patient application of surveyors, lawyers, and territorial officials who understood which direction the money was flowing. By the summer of 1884, the company controlled or claimed to control the water rights on approximately 40% of the productive land in the valley, and the remaining 60% was discovering, in various ways, what that meant. The woman who stood inside the land office, across the counter from the water commissioner, was named Eugenia Voss. She was 38 years old. She had come to Seco Springs from Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1877, 7 years prior, with her husband Thomas Voss and their daughter Calla, who had been 9 at the time and was now 16, and taller than her mother by 2 inches. Thomas Voss had died of a fever in the winter of 1879, leaving Eugenia with the farm, the debt on the farm, a daughter, and a reputation in the valley as a woman who could figure things out. It was the kind of reputation that was paid for in ways that do not show on any ledger. The first thing Cole Harlan knew about Eugenia Voss was the sound of her voice through the window, which was not raised but was extremely precise. She said that the survey the commissioner was referencing was not the survey she had. She said the survey she had, which was filed with the territorial recorder in Las Cruces in April of 1877, placed the property boundary 40 yards north of where the company's survey placed it, and that 40 yards was the difference between the company's water tower sitting on company land and the company's water tower sitting on her land. She said she was prepared to discuss the matter. The commissioner told her the company's survey had been certified by a licensed territorial surveyor in February of 1884. Eugenia Voss told him that her survey had been certified by a licensed territorial surveyor in April of 1877. There was a pause. The commissioner told her the more recent survey superseded the earlier one. She said that was not how property law worked and asked him to show her the statute. Cole Harlan took out his wanted notices again and looked at them without reading them and thought about the woman on the other side of the wall who was doing something most people in her position did not do, which was hold her ground in the precise language of the institution that was trying to move her, and doing it well enough that the room had gone quiet. He put the notices back in his pocket and walked around to the front of the building. Eugenia Voss had been in Seco Springs since 1877, and what she had built in those 7 years was specific and legible to anyone who looked at it straight. The farm sat on 120 acres in the eastern bend of the Rio Seco Valley, where the land flattened out enough to plow and the soil held enough moisture through July to bring in a modest corn crop alongside the kitchen garden that was neither modest nor incidental. It produced enough to feed the family through winter and still sell 2 or 3 wagon loads a season to the mercantile in town. Thomas Voss had chosen the parcel because of the well, a 12-foot hand-dug affair that hit water at 9 feet and ran clear year-round, and because the land was priced at 60 cents an acre in 1877, which was as much as they could manage. The whole purchase had been $422, of which $312 had been borrowed from a Kansas City land bank at 7% annually, and the remaining $110 had come from the sale of a piano that had been in Eugenia's family since before the war, and that she had been unable to justify keeping any longer, given what it represented in terms of freight costs alone. Thomas had been a steady farmer and a quiet man. He had the kind of physical competence that the frontier rewarded. He could build a straight fence, read a cloud for rain, pull a calf without dramatics, and keep his mouth shut when keeping his mouth shut was the right answer. When he died in February of 1879, the fever taking him in 11 days from onset to burial, Eugenia had walked to the corner of the property nearest the road and stood there for a long time looking at the distance. Then she had walked back and made breakfast for Calla and begun the work of managing 120 acres without a second adult on the property. She did not have many options, and she was not sentimental about enumerating them. The nearest neighbor was a family named Quintero, a quarter-mile north, who had their own sufficiency of trouble and could not be leaned on for more than occasional help at harvest. The town of Seco Springs had a church, a doctor, a land office, and a general sentiment that a woman farming alone was admirable in the abstract and someone else's problem in the specific. Eugenia had hired 2 men for the 1879 season, paid them in a combination of cash and food, and gotten through the harvest with a yield that was not good, but was not zero. And she had learned in that season what she could do herself and what required help, and had calibrated every subsequent year accordingly. By 1881, the mortgage to the Kansas City Land Bank had been paid down to $200. By 1883, it was $84, and Eugenia expected to clear it entirely before the end of 1884, which was the private goal against which she measured most things. She kept the farm books in a ledger that she had bought in Las Cruces and maintained in a hand that was small and consistent, every entry dated and categorized, a record of 7 years of decisions that had mostly been correct and occasionally had not been, but had never been careless. The water tower had gone up in the early spring of 1883. This was the center of the thing, and it required some precision to describe. The Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company had been drilling and developing water infrastructure throughout the valley in the period between 1881 and 1883. And one element of this infrastructure was a series of elevated storage tanks, water towers, in the practical parlance of the era, that served both as reserves for the company's grazing operations and as pressure sources for whatever modest pipe systems the company was beginning to lay toward the town itself. In March of 1883, a crew of 12 men had arrived at the eastern edge of the Rio Seco Valley with a wagon load of timber, a surveying kit, and a set of instructions from the company's territorial superintendent, a man named Aldous Prentice, that directed them to construct a water tower at coordinates that placed it, by the company's survey, on company land. The crew had spent a day setting out stakes and marking the footprint of the tower. They had spent a second day digging the post holes. They had spent a third day setting and bracing the main uprights, which were 12-inch square sawn timbers 14 feet high, and had made enough noise doing it that every person within half a mile knew something substantial was being built. On the evening of the third day, Eugenia Voss had walked out to the site and stood looking at the structure for a time, and then had walked back to the farmhouse and gotten her survey documentation from the cedar box where she kept all of her important papers, and had read it carefully in the lamplight, and had done the arithmetic 3 separate times. The tower was on her land, not by a few feet, by approximately 38 yards, the northeast corner of the tower's footprint falling within the boundary of Eugenia Voss's 120 acres, as established by the survey filed in Las Cruces in April of 1877. She had gone back out the following morning before the crew arrived and spoken to the foreman, a compact and perpetually sunburned man named Wallace Drum. She had shown him her survey. Wallace Drum had looked at it with the careful attention of a man who could read but was not accustomed to interpreting legal documents, and had told her that his orders came from the company and the company's surveyor, and that if there was a discrepancy in the surveys, that was a matter for someone above his station, and that he would send a message to Superintendent Prentice in Las Cruces. The message had taken 2 weeks to produce a response. The response, when it came, was a letter from a company lawyer in Santa Fe named Hedgewick Crane, who informed Eugenia Voss in 4 paragraphs of careful prose that the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company's survey was authoritative, that the tower was on company land, and that while the company appreciated her concern, no further action was required on her part. By the time the letter arrived, the tower had been completed and was operational. It stood 22 feet at the tank, held 800 gallons, and was connected to a pump that drew from a bore well the crew had sunk nearby. It was, in the physical sense, an impressive piece of infrastructure for the territory in 1883. It was also, by Eugenia Voss's calculation and her 1877 survey, sitting on her land without her permission. She had gone to the land office in April of 1883, 14 months before the morning Cole Harlan stood outside its window. She had presented her survey documentation to the clerk, a young man named Henry Archuleta, who was genuinely trying to be helpful within the limits of what his position allowed, and had asked him to compare the 2 surveys. Henry Archuleta had done so and had told her that the discrepancy was real, but that the resolution of competing surveys required a ruling from the Territorial Recorder's Office in Las Cruces, and that the process for requesting such a ruling involved filing a formal dispute, paying a fee of $3, and waiting for the Recorder's Office to schedule an inquiry. He had given her the form. She had filed it in April of 1883. She had paid the $3. By August of 1884, 16 months later, the inquiry had not been scheduled. In the interim, the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company had commissioned a new survey, completed in February of 1884, which placed the tower's footprint entirely on company land, and had presented this survey to the Water Commissioner's office as the authoritative document. The Water Commissioner, a man named Frederick Stroud, who had been appointed to his position by the territorial governor, and who understood his relationship to the company's capital interests in a clear-eyed way, had accepted it. This was what had produced the Wednesday morning in the land office, and the commissioner's announcement, and Eugenia Voss standing on the other side of the counter saying that was not how property law worked, and asking to see the statute. There was no statute. Commissioner Stroud knew there was no statute. Eugenia Voss knew there was no statute. What there was, instead, was a process by which the person with more resources and more institutional access would outlast the person with fewer of both, and the process had been working reliably for 3 years. Cole Harlan pushed open the door of the land office. He had been marshal of the Lower Seco Springs District for 11 years, appointed by the territorial governor in 1873, after a period of service as a deputy under a man named Frank Alcott, who had retired to Albuquerque and whose letters Harlan still received occasionally, full of domestic news and always ending with a question about whether Harlan had found anyone worth eating supper with on a regular basis. He had not. The district covered roughly 400 square miles of valley and mesa country, and had at any given time between 1 and 3 active criminal cases, plus the ongoing management of disputes, livestock questions, boundary disagreements, and the periodic violence that attended payday weekends in any town with a saloon, and men who had been working in the heat for 6 weeks. He dealt with all of it systematically and without theater. He was known in Seco Springs and the surrounding country as a man whose word was exact and whose patience was deliberate, meaning he gave it once and did not extend it indefinitely. His Apache mother, whose name was Nadesti, had been from the Mescalero band of the Sacramento Mountains, and she had died when Cole was 14 from a respiratory illness that the doctor in the nearest Anglo settlement had declined to treat because she was Apache and the waiting room was full. Cole had watched this happen and had understood something about institutions that most 14-year-olds in better circumstances did not need to understand. He had carried that knowledge into every subsequent encounter with bureaucracy, which was to say, he knew exactly what a system that appeared neutral actually protected, and he knew how to operate within it, and when to operate around it, and what it cost either way. He was not personally acquainted with Eugenia Voss, though he knew who she was in the way that a marshal knows everyone in 400 square miles who stays and pays their taxes and does not cause trouble. He had seen her in town on supply days, moving through her business efficiently and without waste, the kind of person who was visible in a community by virtue of simply being steadily present year after year. He had come to the land office that morning on a different matter, the wanted notices from Las Cruces, and a question about a deed transfer related to an estate case he was managing. He had stood outside the window because he had assessed the room and decided to wait, and in waiting, he had heard the commissioner's announcement, and then he had heard Eugenia Voss's response, and he had held still for a moment on the outside of the building and let the whole thing settle into the category of things that required attention. He pushed open the door. The room had 4 people in it. Commissioner Frederick Stroud stood behind a long counter of raw pine, wearing a brown wool coat inappropriate to the temperature, with the particular bearing of a man who was accustomed to decisions going his way without requiring him to raise his voice. Eugenia Voss stood on the near side of the counter, wearing a calico work dress and a hat she had not removed, holding a folded document in both hands with the careful firmness of someone who understood that the document was her argument. Henry Archuleta was at a side desk, looking at neither of them. In the back of the room, near a second door that led to an inner office, stood a man Cole did not immediately recognize, well dressed for the territory, collar buttoned, hair oiled, carrying the quiet confidence of employed legal counsel. That would be the company's lawyer, Harlan judged, or someone close to that function. Commissioner Stroud looked at Cole Harlan the way officials who are in the middle of something tend to look at marshals, a mixture of acknowledgement and the hope that the acknowledgement would suffice, and Harlan would find his business elsewhere. Cole Harlan did not find his business elsewhere. He walked to the counter and stood beside Eugenia Voss, not in front of her, and looked at Stroud and said, "I have a question about jurisdiction." Stroud said, "Marshal, we're in the middle of a land matter." Harlan said, "I know. My question is about that land matter." Stroud waited. Harlan said, "When a water company builds a structure on land, the ownership of which is under active dispute in the recorder's office in Las Cruces, and the dispute was filed before the structure was built, does the company or the commissioner's office have authority to adjudicate ownership? Because what I learned in Frank Alcott's office in '72 was that a pending territorial dispute freezes the status of the land in question pending the inquiry. I'm asking if that's still the rule, or if it changed." The room was quiet. It had not changed. Everyone in the room knew it had not changed. What had happened was that the pending dispute had been allowed to sit, and the company had moved forward in the assumption that sitting was the same as lapsing, and Commissioner Stroud had accepted that assumption because the company's capital was a fact about the territory that preceded and would likely outlast his tenure in office. Stroud said, "The pending dispute is a matter for the recorder's office." Harlan said, "It is, which means this office doesn't have jurisdiction to certify the company's survey over the filed dispute, which means what you said through the window about the survey being finalized and the land belonging to the company was not in this office's authority to say." The well-dressed man near the back door said, "Marshal, the company's survey was certified by a licensed." Harlan turned and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I know who certified it and when. I'm not talking about the survey. I'm talking about this office's authority to act on it while a competing claim is pending in Las Cruces. Those are different questions." He turned back to Stroud. He said, "What I'd like to see is the documentation for the October 1st notice you gave this woman, the written order, the legal basis cited, and the signature authority." Stroud said, "That notice was preliminary." Harlan said, "Then I'd like the preliminary documentation." Nobody in that room moved. Stroud reached below the counter and produced a folder. He extracted a single sheet of paper and placed it on the counter. Harlan picked it up and read it with the unhurried attention of someone who has read many documents and has learned not to skip the signatures and the dates. He set it back down. He said, "This is issued under the Commissioner's general authority, citing the certified survey of February 1884. It doesn't reference the pending dispute filed April 1883. He looked at Stroud and said, "Was this office aware of the pending dispute when this notice was issued?" Stroud said, "The recorder's process and our process are." Harlan said, "Were you aware of it?" Stroud said that the office maintained its own records. Harlan looked at Henry Archuleta, who was no longer looking at anything in particular. He said, "Henry, is there a cross-reference in this office's file on the Voss parcel to the dispute filed in Las Cruces in April of '83? Henry Archuleta was quiet for a moment. Then he said that there was a notation in the margin of the parcel file. Harlan said, "Then the notation was in the file when this notice was prepared." He did not phrase it as a question. The well-dressed man near the back said, "The notation is not a legal determination." Harlan said, "No, but it's knowledge, and when you issue an eviction-style notice on land that your own file notes is under pending dispute, you're not operating under authority. You're operating under assumption." He picked up the notice and folded it once and placed it in front of Eugenia Voss. He said to her, "This notice doesn't have the legal weight they implied it had." "You don't have an October 1st deadline," he said to Stroud. "The recorder's office in Las Cruces has had this dispute for 16 months without scheduling an inquiry. I'm going to send a letter to the recorder today with a copy to the marshal's office in Santa Fe, asking for the inquiry to be scheduled within 60 days. If there's a reason it hasn't been scheduled, I'd like to know what it is." Stroud said, "You can write whatever letters you like." Harlan said, "Yes." He looked at the document Eugenia Voss was holding and said, "Is that your survey?" She said it was. He said, "Would you give me the filing date and the recorder's case number?" She told him. He wrote them in a small notebook he carried. He said, "I'll need a copy of this for the letter." She said she had a copy at the farmhouse which she would make available to him. He said he would ride out that afternoon. He did not say anything further to Stroud or to the well-dressed man. He nodded to Henry Archuleta, who received the nod with the expression of a man who was simultaneously relieved and anxious, and went back to whatever it was he had been doing. He walked out of the land office. Eugenia Voss followed him into the street, and there was a moment outside the building where the light was full and bright, and the dust on the street was still from the morning heat, and she said, "Marshal Harlan, I want you to know I've been trying to resolve this for 16 months without taking up anyone's time." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not asking for anything outside the process." He said, "You're inside the process. The process is what's being used against you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." He said, "The letter goes today. After that, it moves at whatever speed it moves. But the October 1st notice doesn't stand on what I saw in there." She said, "Thank you, specifically and without excess." He said he would be out that afternoon for the copy. He rode out at 2 o'clock, taking the eastern road out of town along the Rio Seco, the horse moving at a steady pace in heat that was still impressive at mid-afternoon. The mountains to the southwest taking on the flat look that came in August, when the sky had no clouds and the light went straight down without reflection. He had ridden this road before on other business, but it was different coming toward it with a specific purpose and specific knowledge of what was at the end of it. The Voss farm was visible from a quarter-mile, and it told him things at that distance. The fields on the south side of the road were in corn that was full and green despite the dry summer, which meant irrigation management of some skill. The kitchen garden was visible from the road, laid out in the organized rows of someone who grew things with intention. The farmhouse itself was whitewashed adobe, the surface maintained. One window on the east side recently reglazed. The fence along the road was in repair. There was a barn, a small outbuilding, a stock corral with 2 horses and 4 goats. Everything that could have fallen into disrepair in 7 years without a second adult to maintain it had been maintained. This was not accident. This was daily decision. The water tower was visible from the moment he turned off the road onto the farm track. It stood at the northeast corner of the property, exactly as the reports and his own measurement of the conflict described. A structure of substantial engineering for the territory, 22 feet of timber and iron banding, and a tank that held 800 gallons, connected by a half-inch pipe to the bore well 30 feet east. The pipe ran underground from the well to the tower. The tower itself was constructed on 4 principal posts and a secondary bracing frame, and from the shadow it cast in the afternoon light, it was clear that it sat on land that was, by any honest reading of the 1877 survey, part of the Voss parcel. Calla Voss came out of the barn as he rode into the yard. She was 16, tall, dark-haired like her father from the photographs Harlan had seen in the land office records, and she had the watchful bearing of a person who had grown up in a place where watchfulness was a practical skill. She said her mother was in the house and would be out. Eugenia came out in 2 minutes with the copy of the survey documents in a leather folder and a cup of water that she handed him before anything else. He drank it. She did not say anything about whether he needed it or not. She handed him the folder. He looked through the documents carefully, standing in the yard in the shade of the barn's overhang. The survey was clear, professionally done by a man named Ezra Pitts, who had been a territorial surveyor since 1869, and whose work Harlan was familiar with from other cases. Pitts was methodical and accurate, and had no known relationship with the Southern Consolidated Interests. The boundary markers were precisely described with reference to a stone cairn at the southeast corner that Harlan could see from where he stood, still in place, undisturbed. He copied the relevant numbers into his notebook. He said, "The tower was built before the new survey." She said, "Yes." He said, "They built it on your land, then commissioned a survey to say it wasn't your land." She said, "That's my reading." He said, "Ezra Pitts is still working out of Las Cruces. He filed the original. He could testify to his own methodology." She said she had considered writing to him, but had not been certain it was appropriate outside the formal process. Harlan said, "Write to him. Tell him what's at issue, and ask him if he would be available to speak to the recorder's office inquiry. He can decide for himself." She said she would. He looked at the tower again. It was running. He could hear the faint sound of water moving in the pipe, and it served the company's operations on the land east and north of the Voss property. Removing it, if the survey dispute was resolved in her favor, would be a significant engineering undertaking. The company would resist. But the question of what to do with the tower was downstream of the question of whether the land was hers, and the land question had not been answered yet. He said, "When the inquiry is scheduled, you'll need to be in Las Cruces for it. Do you have a way to get there?" She said the Quinteros would look after Calla and the farm for a few days if needed. He said, "Good." He handed the folder back to her and said he had what he needed for the letter. She said, "Marshal, what do you think is going to happen?" He thought for a moment and said, "I think the inquiry will go your way on the survey question. Pitts's work is solid and it predates theirs. The company will argue that the tower was built in good faith under their survey, and they may ask for compensation or a settlement rather than removal. You'll have a decision to make about that." She said, "I know what I want." He said, "What's that?" She said, "I want the tower to stay where it is." He looked at her. She said, "It doesn't bother me. It's a structure. It works. The water it stores, the company moves through pipe to the north. It doesn't affect my well. What bothers me is that they built it on my land without asking, and then tried to say it wasn't my land. Those are two different problems. If they had come to me in March of 1883 and said, 'Mrs. Voss, we'd like to put a water tower on the north end of your property,' and made it worth my while, I would have considered it. They didn't." Harlan said, "So you want the land question settled and then a formal agreement?" She said, "I want a lease, a proper one, recorded in the county office, that says the tower sits on my land and the company pays me for the privilege. I want $1 a year." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know what it's worth to them. They'd pay $50 a year and be glad of it. I'm asking for $1. Because I want the amount to be something they'll never argue about. I want there to be no year in which they decide the cost is too high and try to move the tower or reclaim the land. $1 is something they'll pay forever, without a second thought. And every year they pay it. The paperwork says it's my land." Cole Harlan looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years solving problems with the minimum force available, and had just heard someone describe his own method in different words. He said, "That's a good approach." She said, "I've had 16 months to think it through." He said, "Write to Pitts today. I'll have the letter to the recorder's office in Santa Fe by this evening's outgoing post." He rode back toward town. The letter to the recorder's office in Las Cruces was 47 words long. It cited the case number, the filing date, the 16-month wait, and the recent action by Commissioner Stroud's office. and it asked in plain language that the inquiry be scheduled within 60 days. The copy to the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe was a duplicate, with a cover note explaining that the Lower Seco Springs District had an active interest in the outcome. Cole Harlan wrote both letters at his desk in the Marshal's office, which was a single room in a building that also housed the Justice of the Peace and a storage room full of seized equipment, and he addressed them and paid the postage from the office account, which he kept with the same precision Eugenia Voss kept her farm ledger, and he put them in the outgoing mailbag for the evening coach. He did not tell Eugenia Voss that the letter was 47 words, or that he had written it himself, or that he had also spoken informally that evening to Caleb Morrow, who was the Justice of the Peace, and a man whose private view of the Southern Consolidated Company's territorial ambitions was rather lower than his public posture required, and who said that if the inquiry produced the expected result, he knew a man in Las Cruces who could have a draft lease agreement ready within 2 weeks of a ruling. He did not tell her any of that because none of it had happened yet, and Cole Harlan was not a man who delivered news before it was news. The inquiry was scheduled for November of 1884. It took place in the recorder's office in Las Cruces over 2 days, in the 3rd week of that month, before a panel consisting of the territorial recorder, a deputy recorder, and an appointed assessor from the Land Commission. Eugenia Voss attended both days. Cole Harlan attended the 2nd day, having ridden down from Seco Springs on a matter that happened to have the same resolution date, but which he filed separately in his office records as unrelated business. Ezra Pitts attended the 1st day. He was 61, lean, white-bearded, and spoke about his 1877 survey with the particular authority of a man who had kept every field note he had ever taken and could produce them on request. He produced them. He explained his methodology for the boundary markers, described the stone cairn at the southeast corner, noted that he had cross-referenced his measurements against a federal survey point established in 1869, and said that in 41 years of surveying in the territory, he had not made an error of 38 yards on a boundary line, and did not believe he had done so here. The company's representative, who was not the well-dressed man from the land office but a different lawyer from Santa Fe, presented the 1884 survey. The panel asked a number of questions about the methodology used to establish the reference points for the 1884 survey. The lawyer answered that the surveyor had used the most current available data. The panel asked what the most current available data had been. The lawyer said he would need to consult his documentation. The inquiry was continued to the 2nd day. On the 2nd day, the panel noted that the 1884 survey appeared to reference a federal survey point that had been remeasured and corrected in 1881, and that the correction had been entered in the Federal Land Office records in Santa Fe, and that the 1884 survey's use of the uncorrected 1869 figure introduced an error consistent with the 38-yard discrepancy between the two surveys. The panel ruled in November of 1884 that the boundary of the Voss parcel as established by the 1877 survey was authoritative, and that the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company's water tower was situated on land belonging to Eugenia Voss. The ruling was entered in the recorder's ledger. The recording fee was $1.50. Eugenia Voss paid it. Cole Harlan was in the back of the recorder's office when the ruling was read. He did not go forward. When Eugenia Voss turned toward him, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement and looked away in the direction of a window. Outside the recorder's office, on the street in Las Cruces, she walked to where his horse was tied and said, "The lease." He said, "Caleb Morrow knows a man." She said, "I know. He wrote to me." He said, "Then you have what you need." She said, "I want to know what this cost you. Not money. I mean in terms of the company, and this office, and whoever they know in Santa Fe." He looked at the mountains. He said, "It cost what it costs. It was the right thing to do." She said, "Is there anything you need from me?" He said, When you have the lease signed, send me a copy for the district file. I want it in the record. She said, "That's all you want?" He said, "That's what the situation calls for." He untied his horse and rode back toward Seco Springs. The lease was drafted by the Las Cruces attorney, a man named Teodoro Gallegos, in the first week of December of 1884. It was written in both English and Spanish, which was Gallegos's practice on any document that might be adjudicated in the territory, and it specified that the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company held a lease on a parcel of 40 square feet of land at the northeast corner of the Voss property, described by metes and bounds, for the purpose of maintaining a water storage tower, at a term of 1 year renewable in perpetuity, at a consideration of $1 per year payable on the 1st of January. The lease was signed by Eugenia Voss and by Aldous Prentice, the company's territorial superintendent, who signed it in the company's Santa Fe office on December 9, 1884, without attending in person, the documents being carried by a courier, which Cole Harlan thought told you something about what the company thought of the settlement relative to the alternative. The original was filed with the county recorder in Seco Springs on December 21, 1884. A copy was sent to Cole Harlan's office. He put it in the district records under the property index, filed under V for Voss, Eugenia, and under the subheading that he had created in his own filing system for cases involving institutional land disputes, of which there had been 4 in his 11 years in the district. He wrote a line in his case log: "Matter resolved, lease executed, title confirmed, $1 per year." He did not write anything else. The first dollar arrived on January 2, 1885. The company's bookkeeper in Santa Fe had mailed it, apparently because that was the system they used for small recurring payments, and it came as a single coin in a small envelope with a printed receipt form, the kind of administrative transaction that occupied no one's attention. Eugenia Voss received it, recorded it in her ledger on the income page. $1, Southern Consolidated, Tower Lease, January 1885, and put the coin in the box where she kept working cash. It was a small moment. It was the whole point. The spring of 1885 came early to the Seco Springs Valley, which was unusual, and the early spring meant that Eugenia Voss had her corn in the ground by the first week of April, 2 weeks ahead of her ordinary schedule. The kitchen garden was expanded that year by a quarter section on the south side, planted in squash and beans, the crops her mother had grown in Kansas, and that she had grown herself since Calla was old enough to help with the harvest. The corn yield in the fall of 1885 was 112 bushels, the best she had put up in 8 years of farming the parcel, and she sold 42 of those bushels to the mercantile in Seco Springs, and another 18 to the Quintero family, at a price that reflected fair dealing and the kind of transaction that does not require a written record between neighbors who trust each other. The mortgage on the land had been cleared entirely in October of 1884, 1 month before the inquiry in Las Cruces. She had not mentioned this to anyone except Calla, and Calla had said, "Good," and gone back to whatever she was doing, which was the appropriate response from a 16-year-old who had watched her mother work toward a number for 6 years. By the spring of 1886, Calla was 18 and had taken on a formal share of the farm's management, handling the kitchen garden accounts and the sales records with a precision that reflected her mother's ledger-keeping habits and a mathematical aptitude that was her own. She had been offered a teaching position at the schoolhouse in Seco Springs for the coming fall term, and had not decided whether to take it, but the offer was there, and the fact that it was there said something about the standing of the Voss name in the valley after 18 months of having their property rights confirmed by the territorial recorder. The water tower continued to operate. The company's operations north and east of the Voss property ran through it, the stored water moving by pipe toward the grazing areas and eventually toward the town's own developing water system. Eugenia Voss looked at it most mornings from the window of the farmhouse. It was visible from the kitchen. and she felt no particular animus toward the structure itself. It was a fact about her land, like the cairn at the southeast corner, and the well in the yard, and the way the light came over the eastern ridge in January, at an angle that meant the north field stayed in shadow until 9 in the morning. It was one of the things that was there. The dollar came every January, regular as tax season, in a small envelope from Santa Fe. Cole Harlan rode past the Voss farm on his ordinary rounds through the district, which took him along the eastern road roughly twice a month, and he could see the tower from the road and the fields and the farmhouse. And occasionally he saw Eugenia Voss in the yard or in the fields, and he raised a hand in passing and she raised one back, and that was the exchange between a marshal doing his rounds and a landowner who had been treated correctly. There was nothing more in it than that, and there did not need to be. He had other cases. There were always other cases. In 1885, there was a cattle theft case that took him as far south as the Mexican border and kept him in the saddle for 11 days in July heat. In 1886, there was a dispute over a mining claim near the Sacramento Mountains that involved 3 men with competing paperwork and 1 man without any paperwork, who had the strongest position of the 4, and resolving it required a week in the field and 2 hearings before the justice of the peace. In 1887, there was a period of unusual quiet that lasted from February through April, and that he used to rebuild the rear wall of the marshal's office, which had been deteriorating since the building was constructed in 1869 and was past the point of patching. He heard from Frank Alcott in Albuquerque twice a year. The letters still ended with the question about supper, and he still had not found a satisfactory answer to give. The Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company went through a change in ownership in 1887, the Philadelphia Investment Group selling its territorial interest to a syndicate based in St. Louis. The new owners reviewed their assets and liabilities across the territory and found, among the water tower leases, a line item for $1 per year on a parcel in the Seco Springs district, recorded against a property owned by Eugenia L. Voss, and someone in the accounting office in St. Louis noted it as an anomaly and wrote a letter asking whether the lease rate could be renegotiated to a more appropriate figure. The letter went to the new territorial superintendent, who had replaced Aldous Prentice in the ownership change, and the new superintendent wrote to Eugenia Voss asking if she would consider amending the lease to reflect current market rates for comparable easements, which he suggested might be in the range of $15 to $20 per year. Eugenia Voss replied that the lease was recorded with the county, was in good standing, and that she had no wish to amend it. She kept her reply to 2 sentences. She sent a copy to Cole Harlan's office as a matter of record. Harlan filed it under V for Voss, Eugenia, alongside the original lease copy. The superintendent did not write again. By 1890, Seco Springs had grown to nearly 1,500 people. The railroad had been extended to within 12 miles of the town in 1888, and the combination of easier freight access and a moderately wet 2-year period had encouraged enough new settlement to change the character of the place in ways that were visible. A second mercantile, a hotel, a small bank that was locally owned and had no connection to the territorial financial interests, and a school that had expanded to 2 rooms and needed a third. Calla Voss had been teaching at that school since 1887, having taken the position when it was offered a second time, and she was considered one of the better teachers in the district by the parents who had children old enough to have opinions about such things. Eugenia Voss was 44 in 1890. The farm was, by any measure that she applied to it, what she had intended it to be: productive, clear of debt, sustainable in drought years, and capable of genuine output in good ones. The kitchen garden had become, in a modest way, a commercial operation, with a regular contract to supply the hotel's kitchen starting in 1889, a relationship that had begun when the hotel's proprietor had eaten a meal at the church social in the fall of that year and had asked, with genuine curiosity, where the squash had come from. The contract was for $8 a month in growing season, which ran from April through October, and represented $56 per year of income that had not existed in 1888. Cole Harlan attended the church social in the fall of 1889. He sat at the end of a long table and ate the food that was brought to him, and did not say much. He was aware that the squash in the dish in front of him was good, though he did not know at the time whose it was. He knew by the following spring, because the contract between Eugenia Voss and the hotel had required a witness for the signing, and the hotel proprietor had asked the marshal's office to provide one, which was not strictly speaking a marshal's function but was the kind of practical request that marshals in small towns accommodate, because the alternative is that small towns stop trusting their marshals with practical matters. He witnessed the signing. He noted the amount. He noted the date. He did not note his own observation, which was that the $8 a month represented exactly what a person deserved to receive from land they had worked, and a skill they had developed over 13 years of decision-making in difficult country. He rode back to his office and recorded the witness function in the district log and went on to the next thing. The tower was still there in 1890. It had been repaired in 1888. The company's maintenance crew had come to the property and asked Eugenia Voss for access, which they were obligated to do under the lease terms because the lease required them to give 7 days' notice before any work on the structure. They had given the notice. She had confirmed receipt. They had come and replaced 3 of the secondary bracing timbers and resealed the tank, and they had left the property in better order than they had found it, and she had signed the maintenance log as the property owner, which was what the lease required. That signature appeared in the company's own maintenance records as Eugenia L. Voss, landowner. The dollar came in January of 1891, as it had come every January for 7 years. The company's accounting system had absorbed the anomaly into its routine, and no one in St. Louis asked about it anymore, because $7 over 7 years was below the threshold at which accounting questions were raised, and because whoever had originally written the letter asking about renegotiation had presumably been promoted or transferred or had left the company, and institutional memory on small matters is not deep. By 1895, Calla Voss had married a man named Robert Archuleta, who was the younger brother of Henry Archuleta from the land office, and who taught mathematics at the school where Calla taught reading and writing. They lived in town, on a street 2 blocks from the school, in a house they were purchasing on a 12-year note from the local bank. Calla walked out to the farm on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, and sat with her mother in the kitchen, and drank coffee, and talked about the school and the farm and the town, and the things that were changing in the valley, and the things that were not. Eugenia had put a second coat of whitewash on the farmhouse in the spring of 1895, and it stood in the morning light as clean and legible as it had in 1877, though the trees she had planted along the south fence in 1880 had grown to a height that gave the yard genuine shade from 2 in the afternoon onward. Cole Harlan was 55 in 1895 and had been marshal of the Lower Seco Springs district for 23 years. The territory had become a state. New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, but the machinery of change was visible much earlier, and the marshal's authority and jurisdiction were increasingly entangled with county sheriff's offices and federal structures that had not existed when Frank Alcott had first given Cole Harlan a badge and a set of jurisdictional boundaries and a handshake. He navigated the entanglements with the same systematic patience he brought to everything. He was not a man who retired gracefully, in the sense that he had not yet tried it, but he was beginning to think about what the district would require after him, which was a different way of thinking about his work than he had practiced when he was 30. He still rode the Eastern Road on his rounds. He still saw the Voss farm. He still raised a hand. In the late summer of 1897, the Southern Consolidated Water and Cattle Company ceased territorial operations in New Mexico. The St. Louis syndicate that had owned it since 1887 had overextended itself in a series of speculative water rights purchases in Arizona and Colorado, and the resulting financial pressure had required the sale of the New Mexico assets in a process that took most of 1896 and 1897. The water infrastructure, the towers, the bore wells, the pipe systems, was sold in portions to various buyers, including the town of Seco Springs itself, which purchased the pipe sections running toward its residential areas and incorporated them into a municipal water system that was voted on at a town meeting in March of 1897 and approved by a margin of 61 to 14. The water tower on the Voss property was purchased by the town of Seco Springs as part of the municipal system acquisition. It was purchased for $225 from the liquidating company's receivers. Before the purchase could be completed, the town's newly appointed water board had to confirm that the structure was properly available for sale. The board was chaired by a man named Eleazar Fuentes, who had been born in the valley in 1868 and had lived his whole life in Seco Springs and knew the local property history better than any outside lawyer would. Fuentes had the deed records pulled, confirmed the 1884 recorder's ruling, found the lease agreement in the county records under V for Voss, and came to see Eugenia Voss at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1897. He told her the town wanted to purchase the tower from the company's receivers and incorporate it into the municipal water system, and that this purchase was contingent on her approval, since the structure sat on her land under a lease arrangement with the old company. She said she was amenable, on the condition that the lease be transferred from the company to the town, with the same terms, and that the recording of the transfer confirm, in writing, the ownership of the land beneath the tower. Fuentes said he had anticipated that condition and had brought the draft transfer document. She read it. She asked about two phrases in the third paragraph. He explained them. She asked him to clarify one of them in writing before she signed. He clarified it the following morning. She signed that afternoon. The lease was transferred to the town of Seco Springs, New Mexico, recorded in the county records on November 3, 1897. The consideration remained $1 per year. The property ownership confirmation in paragraph 4 of the transfer agreement stated that the land on which the tower stood was the property of Eugenia L. Voss of Seco Springs, New Mexico, and that the lease granted the town the right of structural use without conveying any claim to the underlying land. The first dollar from the town arrived on January 2, 1898. It came not as a coin in a small envelope from a corporate accounting office in St. Louis, but as a formal payment order issued by the town treasurer, who was a careful man, and was recorded in the town's accounts as annual lease payment, Voss parcel, tower site, $1. Cole Harlan had retired from the marshal's position in 1901, at the age of 61, having served 29 years in the district. His replacement was a man named Arturo Delgado, 34, who had come up through the deputy system in Doña Ana County, and who was, in Harlan's considered view, the right kind of person for the job. Methodical, resistant to theater, capable of reading a room before he entered it. They had spent a month together in the field, Harlan showing him the district in the way that a person who has moved through a piece of country for 3 decades shows it. Not just the roads, but the logic behind the roads. Not just the names, but the reasons behind the names. Harlan had shown him the Voss farm on that tour, not for any reason that had to do with active business. There was no active business, but because it was in the district and it had a history, and a working marshal should know the history of the things in his district. He had said, "Farm's been here since '77. Owner is Eugenia Voss. The tower on the northeast corner belongs to the town now under a municipal lease. There's a copy of the lease in the district records under V. The ownership of the land is not in dispute and has not been for 16 years. But the document should be in the file, because the situation required attention once, and it might again." Delgado had said, "What was the situation?" Harlan had said, "A water company built on her land without asking, and then said it wasn't her land. Recorder's inquiry in '84 settled it." He had not said anything more about it than that. Eugenia Voss died in the spring of 1919, at the age of 73, having farmed the parcel for 42 years. She died on the farm. Calla was with her. The land passed to Calla Archuleta under the will, which had been drawn up in 1904 by Teodoro Gallegos' son, who had taken over his father's practice in Las Cruces. The will included a specific instruction regarding the lease on the tower parcel. The lease was to be maintained as written, with no modification to the terms, and the property ownership was to be stated explicitly in every subsequent transfer. Eugenia Voss had written 2 sentences in her own hand at the bottom of the relevant paragraph. "The tower may stay. The land is mine." Calla Archuleta honored those instructions without hesitation. She kept the farm for another 12 years, until 1931, when she and Robert transferred the property to their eldest son, Thomas Archuleta, named for his grandfather. The transfer documents included the lease history going back to 1884, the recorder's ruling, and the original lease agreement, all in a cedar box that had once held Eugenia's important papers and that Thomas recognized when his mother handed it to him. Thomas Archuleta farmed the land through the Depression years, which were difficult in ways that the 1880s had been difficult but differently. The market collapse made what the land produced worth less, and the dry years of the early 30s were worse than anything Eugenia Voss had managed. But the land itself was free and clear, the well was good, and the kitchen garden that had been expanded and refined over 50 years of women's knowledge about what grew in that soil continued to produce. The hotel contract had ended when the hotel changed ownership in 1922, but by 1935 Thomas had established a different arrangement with a grocer in Seco Springs that served the same function. The water tower had been repaired twice by the town's water department since the 1897 acquisition, once in 1912 and once in 1927, and was still operational as part of the municipal system, its 800 gallons providing pressure to the residential streets on the east side of town. The town's water department records showed the annual payment to the Voss parcel. The name had not been updated from Voss to Archuleta in the administrative records, because the payment amount was $1, and nobody at the water department had noticed the discrepancy between the deed name and the payee name until a clerk named Dorothy Padilla raised it in 1938, and the town council corrected it in a meeting that lasted 7 minutes. Cole Harlan had died in 1914, at the age of 74, in a room at the back of a boarding house in Seco Springs. He had been reading, according to Arturo Delgado, who found him, a letter from Frank Alcott in Albuquerque, which was the last of the series that had been arriving twice a year since 1873. The letter was 4 pages, full of news about Alcott's grandchildren, and a dog he had acquired, and some opinions about the weather. It ended, as they all had ended, with the question. Harlan had not answered it. The letter was in his coat pocket when they buried him, because Delgado did not know what else to do with it and felt it should stay with him. His case logs were transferred to the county sheriff's office when the district was reorganized in 1916. The logs ran from 1873 to 1901, 29 volumes in a consistent hand, tight, exact, never a word wasted. Among the entries in the volume covering 1884, there was a notation about the Voss case that read as it had read when he wrote it. Matter resolved. Lease executed. Title confirmed. $1 per year. That notation was not remarkable in context. The log had dozens of similar entries, cases that had required attention and had been resolved and been filed under their proper headings. The Voss case was one among 20 or 30 matters in 1884 that had called for his involvement and had been handled and put away. It did not look like what it was from the outside. From the outside, it was a property dispute, resolved by an administrative process in a recorder's office, producing a lease for a nominal sum, filed in a county record, forgotten by most of the people who had been in the room when it was settled. The company had moved on. The commissioner had moved on. The well-dressed man from the back of the land office had moved on to other representations. What had not moved was the land. The cairn at the southeast corner of the Voss parcel was still in place in 1884 and in 1898 and in 1919 and in 1938, when Dorothy Padilla noticed the name discrepancy, and it was still there in 1952 when Thomas Archuleta's daughter, Maria, walked out to the northeast corner of the property on a Sunday afternoon to look at the tower, which was being replaced by the town with a newer steel structure. The original timber construction had deteriorated beyond cost-effective repair, and stood there while the crew worked, watching. She was 31 years old. She had been told the story of the tower her whole life, told it first by her grandmother Calla, and later by her father Thomas, who told it the way the valley told its histories, with the specific names and the specific year, and the exact amount, and no decoration that the facts did not require. She knew about the commissioner and the company and the survey and the inquiry in Las Cruces and the lease for $1 a year. She knew about Ezra Pitts and his field notes. She knew that the cairn at the southeast corner was there because her great-grandmother Eugenia had put it there in 1877 and had checked it every year to confirm it had not been moved. She knew about Cole Harlan. She knew he had walked into the land office on a Wednesday morning in August of 1884 and had asked a question about jurisdiction and had written a letter to 2 offices and had ridden out to the farm that afternoon and had never asked for anything in return. She asked her father once whether Harlan had known Eugenia before the incident. Thomas said not particularly, that they had been acquaintances in the way that everyone in a small district is acquainted with the marshal, that he had known her name and her farm and her history, the way a man who does his job knows the territory he is responsible for. Maria had thought about that. She thought about it again, standing at the northeast corner of her family's property in 1952, watching the town crew dismantle the old tower board by board, the timber dark and checked with age, the tank long since drained, the structure that had stood for 69 years, coming apart in an afternoon. The new tower went up in its place over 3 days. It was steel, 12,000 gallons, mounted on a welded frame, a piece of mid-century municipal infrastructure that looked nothing like what it replaced. When the crew was done, the foreman came to the farmhouse to confirm access would be closed and to note anything that needed attention in the yard. Maria asked him if the lease paperwork had been updated for the new structure. He said he didn't know anything about a lease. She said there had been a lease on the original tower site since 1884, and she wanted to confirm the new structure's location relative to the boundary before anything was finalized. The foreman looked at his plans. He said the new tower was in the same footprint as the old one. She said, "Then the lease transfers. I'll have a letter to the town council by Friday." The letter went to the town council on a Friday in September of 1952. The council reviewed the lease history, which was in the county records going back to 1884, and confirmed the transfer without objection. The consideration remained $1 per year. The property ownership clause remained as Eugenia Voss had written it in the original, and as every transfer document since had maintained it. The $1 came in January of 1953, as it had come every January for 68 years. It came in an envelope from the town treasurer's office, and it was recorded by Maria Archuleta in the farm's account book on the income page for 1953, in the same column her great-grandmother had used in 1885, with the same precision. $1. Tower lease, Voss parcel. The deed to the property, framed under glass in the hallway of the farmhouse by the time Maria's children were old enough to read it, was the original filed document from the Territorial Recorder's Office in Las Cruces, dated November 1884, bearing in the margin an entry in the recorder's hand that confirmed the boundary of the Voss parcel as established by the 1877 survey and noted the resolution of the dispute in favor of the recorded owner. Beneath the main deed, in the same frame, was a single sheet of paper that Maria had added, a photocopy of the lease agreement executed in December of 1884, with the signatures of Eugenia L. Voss and Aldous Prentice, and witnessed by Teodoro Gallegos in Las Cruces. In the consideration clause, in language that had been maintained through every subsequent transfer and every administrative update for nearly 7 decades, the annual amount was stated plainly, $1. There was no photograph of Cole Harlan in the frame. There was no photograph of him in the house at all. He had not been, in the end, a man whose likeness was easily obtained. He had avoided cameras with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to most things, and the record of his involvement in the Voss case was limited to what the paperwork showed: a letter to the recorder's office, a witness notation, a line in the marshal's log. What Maria Archuleta told her children when they asked about the frame in the hallway was not about Cole Harlan, not directly. She told them about Eugenia, and about the survey, and about the inquiry, and about the lease and why it was $1. She told them what the dollar meant, which was that the land was theirs and would remain theirs, and that the proof of it renewed itself every January without anyone having to fight for it again. And when her youngest son asked how the inquiry had happened, given that the dispute had been sitting in an office for 16 months without being addressed, she said that a man had walked into a room and asked a question at the right time. She said he had been the district marshal and that it had been his job to ask questions of that kind, and that he had simply done his job. Her son asked what the man's name was. She said, "Cole Harlan." He asked if he had been a famous man. She looked at the frame on the wall, at the deed and the lease and the dollar figure in the consideration clause, and said that he had been a working marshal in difficult country, and that the famous men were usually not the ones who mattered most to the people they helped, and that what he had left behind was not a legend but a result. The result was that the land was still there, the family was still there, the lease paid every January like a clock. Some debts announce themselves in monuments, others pay themselves quietly, $1 at a time, year after year, in the plain language of a document that says what belongs to whom, and does not require anyone's admiration to remain true.